I wrecked my tank. First off, no you didn't. Vermetids are super common and they can certainly be an annoyance, but there are many ways that we can handle an ever-growing vermetid population. But before we get into all that, what are vermetids? Despite looking a lot like tube worms, vermetids are actually snails, albeit very odd snails. Rather than regularly coiled shells that are carried on their back like other snails, vermetids have very irregular and elongated tubular shells that are molded and cemented to a surface, making them sessile rather than motile. In other words, they're stuck in that spot rather than being able to move around like most snails. They are easy to tell apart from feather duster tubes as they tend to be translucent yellowish brown rather than opaque white. Because they're unable to move around, they've found a pretty novel way to collect food. By creating a mucous net and sending it outward into the water column, they're able to filter feed, collecting particulates floating in the water column and then reeling them back in towards their mouth. They're pretty interesting critters. The problem, however, is that although they're not aggressive pests that are constantly trying to attack their neighbors, their mucous webs are irritating to corals and can also discourage other invertebrates and even fish from grazing where mucus nets are present. What does that mean for your reef tank? Well, it means that vermetids, especially when they're out of control, can irritate your corals, preventing them from opening up. They can take over the rock surfaces where you want corals to grow, and they can stop your cleanup crew from being able to get to nearby algae. Not to mention they're sharp as all get out, which can really suck when you're in there doing maintenance. So while a few here and there aren't a real issue at all, having a large population of vermetids can be quite counterproductive for a reef aquarium. But don't feel too bad about having vermetids in your reef. They are, if we're being honest, nearly impossible to prevent. I have personally never had a reef tank that didn't have at least a few vermetid snails. They are just that prevalent. But that isn't to say that there aren't steps we can take to try and mitigate the introduction of vermetids. So before we talk about how to get rid of the vermetids that you already have, let's look at some of the ways we can prevent them from getting into our systems in the first place. So where do vermetids come from? They come from another system that already has vermetids. So that means live rock from a store or another hobbyist, live sand transferred from another system, water from another system. Yes, they can be free floating. They are broadcast spawners after all. Macroalgae like Chaetomorpha are notorious for harboring pests, as well as on coral bases and skeletons and frag plugs or discs, which is most likely how the vast majority of reefers are getting adult vermetids into their tanks. I'm sure at least one of those sounded pretty familiar to you, and that's a-okay. These are really common mistakes that a lot of reefers make, but that isn't to say we can't do better. There are a number of ways we can help prevent getting vermetids and a variety of other pests into our reef tank. You can use dry rock or pest-free live rock sources. Make sure that you don't use sand from other systems. Do not allow water from another system into yours, i.e. don't let the water in the bag get into your tank with that new coral or invert. Only use clean macroalgae options. And while dipping for vermetids isn't very effective, it is a good practice for a myriad of other pests, so dip all corals and frags either way. What is more effective for vermetids is to remove frag plugs by cutting them off of the coral whenever possible, and inspect each coral closely and remove any vermetids found immediately. Despite trying your hardest to keep them out, there's still a very good chance that they're going to end up in your reef tank. So let's talk about the different ways we can manage a vermetid population in our aquariums, because let's face it, that is going to be a very helpful and useful skill set. First and foremost, like most pests, don't wait to begin treating the first signs. When you start seeing vermetids popping up, you should deal with them right away. If left unchecked, you might find that they begin to take over and become a bigger and more difficult issue to deal with. So let's talk about how you can tackle vermetids. There are essentially 3 ways to approach treating vermetids: natural predators, physical treatment and removal, and improved filtration and reduced feeding. Let's kick things off with natural predators. There is essentially one natural predator known to actively prey on vermetids: bumblebee snails, also known as Pusiostoma mendicaria. Bumblebee snails are named after their striking black and yellow banded shells. They are small, typically an inch or less in size, and they're easy to care for. Unlike other snails that are primarily herbivorous, bumblebee snails are carnivores, and they'll eat a variety of meaty foods, including other snails. And vermetids are convenient prey since they are unable to run away. That being said, they will also prey on other pests like pyramid snails, adding to their utility. Given their small size, they can get into small crevices easily, which is helpful for reaching pests in tight spots, and they aren't prone to knocking over corals and frags like larger snails are. Sounds pretty promising, right? Well, their effectiveness can vary. They will eat all sorts of meaty foods, so if you feed heavily and extra food lands on the rocks or sandbed, bumblebee snails might prefer those meaty morsels since they don't require boring into a shell. There are also all sorts of other small hitchhiking invertebrates and reef tanks that a bumblebee snail might prefer over vermetids, which might mean it takes them a while before they get around to tackling the issue at hand. They can also eat the snails you don't want them to eat. Although that will typically only happen when they've run out of other easier to eat sources of food, it is still an important consideration. So while they're not a perfect solution, they are an effective tool to have in your arsenal given that they are known to eat vermetids. Just don't get too many bumblebee snails thinking brute force will win. The last thing you want is an army of hungry snail-eating snails desperate for food after they've wiped out all of your vermetids. While there have been rumblings that some species of butterfly fish and even puffer fish might also munch on vermetids, they're probably not the best option. Most are more difficult to care for than your average fish, and on top of it, may not be reef safe. In my opinion, they aren't worth the trouble or risk, especially given the lack of evidence that they reliably eat vermetids. Now, a good natural predator is definitely a step in the right direction, but given that they're not always as effective as we'd like them to be, sometimes, we gotta be the predator ourselves and get in there and deal with the problem manually, physically, by removing them ourselves. The easiest way to remove vermetids from a surface is with bone cutters, the same ones you'll often get for trimming SPS corals. You want to be able to get the cutters right against the rock and base of the vermetid, crushing the shell while lifting up and off of the surface. It can be a bit tricky, especially with larger vermetids, but it does work well once you get the hang of it. In some cases, you may only be able to cut off the vertical tube of the vermetid, which unfortunately won't be effective. If that does happen and you can't get the rest of the base removed, you can finish the job by adding a dab of super glue gel to the hole, sealing the shell closed, which will be effective. You can also use super glue gel or even epoxy putty to seal up any vermetid that is hard to reach and can't be removed. Or if you happen to have a really bad infestation of small vermetids covering portions of your rockwork, sometimes it's easiest to just cover them all with a layer of epoxy putty, entombing them forever, giving you a fresh surface to mount corals to. And while I hate to bring it up, your display tank won't be the only place that vermetids show up. They are broadcast spawners, and when they broadcast spawn, their eggs go everywhere. And that includes your overflow box, your plumbing, your sump, and they don't need light, so they will happily make their home anywhere that there is flowing water and particulates to filter feed on. So if you're trying to knock back that vermetid population in your display, you'll also want to remove as many as you can from those other places that I just mentioned in order to slow down their ability to repopulate. Manually removing them from the overflow is usually the best bet. However, if you are able to disassemble your plumbing, you can always soak it all in a citric acid bath along with your sump and equipment, which will effectively remove any vermetids from those places. Your display tank should be a-okay for a few hours without your sump running, provided you have ample circulation from your flow pumps. Just make sure you move your heater to the display tank to keep the temperature stable. Now we move on to improved filtration and reduced feeding. Given that vermetids are filter feeders, a simple and effective way to slow down their spread is to reduce the amount of food that they have access to. This can be done in two ways. Firstly, by improving mechanical filtration to reduce the amount of particulates in the water, and two, by not feeding or dosing any planktonic foods meant for filter feeders. Making sure you're keeping those filter socks clean or implementing an automated fleece roller is a very easy and effective way to reduce the amount of particulates in the water, including uneaten foods. At the same time, make sure that when you feed your fish, you're not overfeeding, which will keep the amount of excess food in the water to a minimum. While many inverts and corals benefit from the addition of planktonic food suspensions, or powdered coral foods for that matter, so will vermetids. Rather than adding fuel to the fire, by holding off on feeding those types of planktonic foods until after the vermetids are under control, you can effectively slow down their population growth, which can give you the advantage. Now, I know that was a lot of info, but if you follow it and keep up with it, even if it doesn't happen immediately, you will absolutely be able to get ahead of this volley of vermetids. And when you do, you're gonna feel like $1,000,000 and your tank is going to thank you for it. Just make sure to follow those preventative measures I talked about at the beginning to really decrease the chances of them getting out of hand again. And although I'm sure you figured it out, vermetids likely won't be the only pests that you face on your reefing journey. So if you'd also like help with all of those other pests and learn how to deal with them effectively, or just prevent them entirely, you can check out the other videos just like this one in this playlist right here.